Chains rattled in the night, echoing through the damp fields of a Georgia plantation. 3 overseers screamed, their muffled voices drowned beneath the swarm of biting ants. Bound and struggling, they were dragged toward a monstrous anthill under the cold moonlight. The woman forcing them forward was no longer just a slave, she was vengeance itself. Her name was Penelope, and her story would become one of the most haunting tales of rebellion in 1854. But how did she reach this moment? Penelope was born beneath the weight of chains, not the lull of freedom. The year was 1828, deep in the blistering cotton lands of southern Georgia. Her first cries were muffled not by joy, but by the rustle of overseers' boots pacing outside the slave quarters. Life for her began where hope ended, on the Whitfield plantation, a sprawling empire of suffering where cotton ruled like a tyrant. Her mother, Abigail, cradled her against a chest marked by scars from the lash. Abigail was a woman of quiet strength, with eyes that seemed to carry centuries of sorrow. She whispered lullabies in hushed tones, songs brought from Africa generations before, their meaning frayed, but their rhythm still carrying the pulse of resilience. At night, Abigail would sing to her daughter about rivers and skies, about a land where chains didn't exist, though her voice always faltered at the end, as if reality had strangled the melody. The Whitfield plantation was ruled by Mistress Eleanor Whitfield. Widowed at an early age, Eleanor inherited the estate when her husband died of fever. She was no fragile Southern belle. She was stern, calculating, and consumed by the preservation of her wealth. She did not whip with her own hand, but her orders dripped with cruelty. Eleanor demanded productivity above all else, and she left the punishment to her hired overseers, men whose loyalty was bought with money and whiskey. From sunrise to sunset, the field stretched endlessly, dotted with figures bent low, their hands torn raw by cotton thorns. The air was always thick, sometimes with heat, sometimes with mist, but always with the smell of sweat, dirt, and despair. Chains clinked faintly as men and women carried baskets heavier than their own frail bodies. Overseers patrolled on horseback, their shadows long in the morning sun, their whips coiled like serpents ready to strike. Penelope's earliest memories were not of toys or play, but of work. She fetched water from the well before she could properly carry the bucket, helped her mother scrub floors until her small hands bled, and endured the same hunger as the adults, stomachs gnawing with emptiness, while Mistress Eleanor and her guests feasted on roasted meats and sweet wine. Yet even in childhood, Penelope was different. She carried an intensity in her eyes, a quiet fire. The other enslaved children laughed when they could, finding brief moments of joy in games of pebbles or chasing each other in the dust. But Penelope often sat apart, listening to the murmurs of adults, watching the overseers with a gaze far too sharp for a child. She remembered details others dismissed: who carried keys, where the dogs were chained, which overseer favored which bottle of liquor. By the age of 12, her beauty was beginning to bloom, and with it came danger. Her skin was smooth, her figure graceful, and her eyes, dark and unyielding, drew unwanted attention. Abigail tried to shield her, keeping her close in the fields, avoiding assignments that placed her within reach of the overseers. But protection on a plantation was fragile as breath itself. At 15, the nightmare descended. One evening, when the moon hung swollen and red, the overseer Thomas Hargrove sent for her under the pretense of work. Abigail begged to go in her place, but was struck down with a whip. Penelope was dragged into the overseer's quarters, the smell of whiskey thick in the air. That night, innocence was ripped from her, her cries smothered against wooden boards, while outside the cicadas sang their indifferent chorus. It did not happen once. It happened again and again. Joseph Tanner followed, a man who wore politeness like a mask, but whose touch was venom. Then came William Crowley, drunken and laughing, reeking of sweat and ale. They passed her between them like something less than human, a possession to be used at will. Her body bore their violence, but her soul grew iron. She learned silence. She learned to hide her rage beneath lowered eyes, to clench her jaw when their hands roamed. But deep within, the ember of vengeance glowed. Each violation was fuel, each humiliation a spark, feeding the fire that smoldered unseen. Life inside the mistress's house was no escape. Mistress Eleanor demanded perfection. Silver polished until it gleamed, floors scrubbed until they reflected candlelight, meals served with flawless precision. Penelope became a fixture in the dining room, carrying trays laden with roasted pheasant, venison, and steaming pies while her own stomach twisted in hunger. She stood silently in the corner while Eleanor and her guests toasted to prosperity, their laughter echoing in the grand halls, unaware or uncaring that their wealth was soaked in blood. Penelope's mother grew frailer with each year. The hard labor, combined with grief over her daughter's suffering, carved away her strength. She often coughed late into the night, her breath rattling like dry leaves. One winter, when frost painted the fields and even the overseers wore coats of fur, Abigail's body surrendered. She died in the slave quarters, her thin hands clutching Penelope's until the last. That night, Penelope wept silently, her tears mixing with the dirt floor. But grief quickly hardened into resolve. She had lost her mother, her protector, her last comfort in a world of cruelty. Now there was nothing left to lose, only a hunger for justice that burned like fire in her veins. The three overseers, Hargrove, Tanner, and Crowley, remained as arrogant as ever, swaggering through the plantation with their whips and rifles. They believed themselves untouchable, above consequence, above fear. They mocked the slaves, beat them senseless for the smallest mistakes, and laughed as they told stories of their cruelty. But Penelope was listening. She memorized their weaknesses. Hargrove's pride made him reckless. Tanner's vanity made him careless. Crowley's drunkenness made him vulnerable. They underestimated her, believing her broken and compliant. They saw only a slave. They did not see the storm gathering behind her quiet gaze. By 1854, Penelope was 26. Her body bore invisible scars, her spirit sharpened into something unbreakable. She had become a woman who moved with purpose, her silence hiding thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. Among the slaves, whispers followed her, some pitied her suffering. Others feared the dark determination they sensed within her. The plantation continued its cruel rhythm, chains at dawn, sweat in the fields, the overseer's boots echoing like drums of doom. But Penelope's days were no longer consumed by fear alone. She was planning, waiting. The overseers had stolen her innocence, broken her mother, and treated her as less than human. And though no one yet knew it, Penelope was preparing to strike back in a way that would shake the plantation to its core. Her vengeance would not be swift. It would not be merciful. It would be a reckoning. But how could a single enslaved woman, bound by chains and watched by armed men, possibly turn the tables on three brutal overseers? The answer was coming, born of patience, cunning, and a fury that could not be extinguished. And when it came, it would change everything. The year was 1854, and the Whitfield plantation breathed cruelty like the air itself. Cotton stretched endlessly across the land, its white tufts swaying beneath the merciless Georgia sun. To the slaves, every stalk was a shackle, every row another chain. Overseers rode through the fields on horseback, their whips slicing the air, their voices sharp as knives. And among them stood three men whose names were cursed in whispers: Thomas Hargrove, Joseph Tanner, and William Crowley. Thomas Hargrove was the brute. Broad-shouldered, his face darkened by years of sun and cruelty, he relished the sound of flesh tearing under his whip. He had a way of smiling as he beat, his teeth clenched in satisfaction, as though each lash were a victory. He took particular delight in punishing Penelope for the smallest mistakes: spilled water, a missed spot on the silver, a moment's hesitation when called. Joseph Tanner was different. Thin, Sharp-featured and calculating, he preferred manipulation over brute force. He whispered poison into the mistress's ear, twisting stories to make slaves appear rebellious or lazy, ensuring they were punished. His cruelty was quiet, deliberate, the kind that gnawed at a person's mind long after the bruise faded. For Penelope, Tanner's interest was the most suffocating. He would brush his hand across her arm when no one looked, lean close to whisper promises he never meant. His touch felt like oil, leaving behind a residue of disgust. William Crowley was the drunk. His breath carried the stench of whiskey, his gait often unsteady, his laughter booming at the most grotesque times, like when a man collapsed in the fields and was flogged until he staggered back up. Crowley used the bottle to excuse his violence. He would stumble into the slave quarters late at night, torch in one hand, whip in the other, searching for someone to torment. Penelope dreaded his footsteps most, because they often ended at her door. Together, the three men formed a trinity of terror. And Penelope stood at the center of their torment. Days bled into nights, nights into days, each one carrying the same rhythm of cruelty. Penelope worked in the mistress's house by daylight, then endured the overseer's attention in the dark. She felt her body breaking, her spirit stretched to the edge. But beneath her silence, a storm was forming, fed by every insult, every violation, every lash. One evening, the plantation celebrated Christmas with a grand feast. The mistress's house glittered with candlelight, tables heavy with roasted meats, pies, and mulled wine. Music drifted from a fiddle as white guests laughed and toasted. In the shadows of the hall, Penelope moved silently, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her stomach gnawing with hunger. She watched as Crowley stumbled drunkenly, sloshing wine onto the carpet, while Tanner whispered into Eleanor Whitfield's ear, earning her cold smile. Thomas Hargrove caught Penelope's eye from across the room. He lifted his glass and a mock toast, his grin wolfish, his meaning unmistakable. Her hands trembled as she lowered the wine jug. For a moment, she imagined smashing it across his skull, watching the crimson liquid mingle with blood on the floor. But she turned away, hiding the fire in her eyes. Later that night, while the plantation lay heavy with drink and feasting, the overseers came. They pulled Penelope from her pallet, dragging her into the cold night. The sound of chains clinked faintly in the distance as dogs barked. The men laughed among themselves, joking crudely, their words stabbing deeper than their hands. When they were finished, they left her in the dirt, her body bruised, her soul ablaze with fury. She lay there beneath the stars, the night air stinging her skin, and something shifted inside her. For years, she had borne the torment in silence, hoping only to survive. But that night, survival no longer felt enough. Revenge began to take root, not as a wild thought, but as a plan. The days that followed only deepened her resolve. She watched the overseers closely, memorizing their patterns. Hargrove often patrolled the fields before dawn, when the mist clung low to the earth. Tanner spent hours in the mistress's study, pretending at business, but mostly admiring his reflection in the polished window. Crowley stumbled drunk by night, often passing out in the barn, his pistol lying forgotten at his side. The plantation slaves whispered about Penelope. Some saw the change in her eyes, the hard glint, the way her silence had turned sharp. A few urged her to be cautious, to not let vengeance claim her life. But others, those who had lost children to the lash, who had watched mothers buried after beatings, silently cheered the thought of rebellion, though they dared not speak it aloud. The cruelty only escalated. One spring morning, when a young boy dropped his cotton basket, Thomas Hargrove ordered him tied to a post. The whip lashed again and again, each crack cutting into flesh as the boy's screams echoed across the fields. Penelope was forced to watch, her nails digging into her palms until blood pooled in her fists. She wanted to rush forward, to shield him, but the weight of rifles held her still. That day, the fire inside her blazed brighter. Joseph Tanner, sensing her fury, leaned close the next evening as she scrubbed the mistress's floor. "Careful, Penelope," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "You carry too much anger in your eyes. A woman like you should learn to smile more." His hand lingered on her shoulder, squeezing, before he walked away. She wanted to spit in his face, but instead she lowered her eyes, hiding her hatred beneath a mask of submission. And then came William Crowley. One humid night, drunk beyond reason, he stumbled into the quarters with a torch in hand. He waved it dangerously near the dry wood walls, laughing as the slaves panicked. "What if I burn this whole place down?" he jeered. He dropped the torch on the dirt floor, laughing until someone quickly stamped it out. He looked at Penelope then, swaying on his feet, and said, "Would you burn with it, girl? Or would you crawl out screaming?" That night, Penelope barely slept. She lay awake, staring into the darkness, her mind whirling. The overseers were reckless, arrogant, certain of their power. But arrogance was weakness, and weakness could be exploited. Her plan began to form, not in vague thoughts of revenge, but in precise details. She knew where the overseers drank, where they stored their ropes, how far the anthill in the far pasture stretched. It was monstrous, a mound alive with thousands of biting ants, feared even by the overseers themselves. More than once, she had heard them joke about sending a slave to the ants as punishment. But what if the punishment was turned upon them? The thought was wild, unthinkable. Yet the ember of vengeance inside her roared at the image: Hargrove, Tanner, and Crowley writhing as the ants consumed them, buried not in glory, but in the dirt they once commanded. And as she carried water the next morning, sweat stinging her eyes, she whispered to herself a vow. "They took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from them." The storm inside her had broken. The overseers had no idea what was coming. The world tilted the night Penelope decided the pain would end, not by pleading, not by escape, but by returning the cruelty in a contorted mirror. She had rehearsed possibilities quietly, like a drumbeat in her head. Poison the overseer's food, set the barn alight, slip a knife into a sleeping hand. Each idea carried risk, each plan a price. But when she pictured the three faces, Hargrove's grimace, Tanner's smug curl, Crowley's bloated laughter, only one image kept burning clear and terrible. The anthill in the far pasture, a living mountain of teeth and sting. The anthill was a thing of nightmares. It rose like a small, black hill in the open field beyond the cotton rows, crusted with dried mud and the restless movement of thousands of ants. Whitfield's men joked that the mound could swallow a man whole. They used the image as a threat, a crude promise of what awaited those who stepped out of line. To the slaves it was a place to avoid, an old, natural tribunal that punished with patient, tireless cruelty. Penelope began to imagine the anthill as an equalizer, not a symbol of their subjection, but the instrument of a reckoning. Her plan had to be cunning, precise, and quiet. It depended on three things she had long observed: Hargrove's pride, Tanner's vanity, and Crowley's drunken carelessness. Each trait was a thread she could pull. The trap would not be forced upon them in the fields, too much risk, too many witnesses. It would be crafted beneath the cover of night, under the crude moonlight that already hid so many of their crimes. Penelope began by laying the groundwork with small, unnoticeable acts. She traded glances, stored tiny things in hidden places, and used the chores that made her invisible to move pieces on a board the overseers didn't know existed. She befriended a boy who worked in the stables and taught him to fetch water at odd hours. She swapped the mistress's sugar bowl with another, so certain servants would be where they needed to be. She memorized watch rotations: who slept where, which dogs were chained nearest the gate, which barn lanterns were left burning. Each detail was a nail in her plan. One evening, she spied the three men at the edge of the orchard, boasting over a bottle passed among them. Hargrove spoke loudly about a prize cockfight he planned to attend in the nearby town. Tanner boasted of a new mirror he'd bought in Savannah and how he'd display it in the mistress's parlor. Crowley laughed about a wager he'd won and the bag of coin he now wore on his belt. They swaggered like kings, blind to the web closing around them. Penelope began to plant seeds of false security. She let it be known, by accident, of course, that the Anthill was rumored to be less alive at night when the stars chilled the soil. She let slips reach Crowley's ears that Hargrove had been boasting of a treasure hidden near the mound, bait for any man whose greed outpaced his sense. She made sure Tanner learned of a secret meeting to be held near the Anthill to discuss the mistress's business, an irresistible lure for a man vain enough to believe he deserved privilege. The night to act approached like a train, slow, inevitable, and loud. Penelope chose a moonless night, when even the silhouettes dissolved into the dark and dog barks were fewer. She enlisted the help of two trusted slaves, old Ruth, whose hands had known every stitch of the Whitfield house for decades, and Daniel, a young man with nimble feet who tended the poultry. She did not deceive them. She told them the truth in whispers that trembled with anger and longing for justice. They listened and agreed with the look in their eyes, a look that said some debts must be paid in full. They prepared tools in secret. Daniel hollowed a wooden bowl until it felt light in his hands. Ruth fashioned a coarse rope from thread scavenged over months. Penelope herself collected cloth patches and lathered them in animal fat and small pins. Simple things that could be turned into instruments of misdirection and restraint. On the chosen night, the plantation slept in heavy, intoxicated silence. Lanterns guttered out, and only the faint glow from the mistress's parlor leaked into the yard, like a wound in the dark. Penelope walked with a heart that beat like a war drum. She moved through shadows like a ghost, closing doors softly behind her, the sound of her feet swallowed by the hush. Her throat was tight, but her steps were steady. They lured the men with whispered promises and a staged fine. Daniel discovered a dropped note near the barn, a crude message suggesting that a hidden cache of goods and a meeting for those in charge would take place by the Anthill. The three men, drunk and greedy, could not resist the bait. Hargrove swaggered first, muttering about bravery and revenge. Tanner went because he craved importance and the chance to ostentatiously command. And Crowley followed, curiosity and liquor doubling him into a reckless shadow. Penelope watched them from the edge of the field, her breath a silent fog. As they approached the Anthill, she saw the moon's pallor fade into the blackness. Only starlight nodded above. The men joked and shoved each other, their shadows long and grotesque. Crowley hummed a drunken tune. Tanner admired his reflection in a silver pocket mirror, its flash vanished by the night. Hargrove boasted in low tones about his next act of violence back at the fields. At just the right moment, Penelope and her two accomplices stepped from the trees and surrounded them, the illusion of happenstance complete. They acted like simple country folk stumbling upon a private meeting, voices rising in alarm. Penelope's voice shook as she spoke, thin and steady. "What's this about treasure?" she asked, as if surprised. The men, already disoriented by the darkness and their own bravado, relaxed, laughing that a woman dared question them. In a heartbeat, the plan snapped into motion. Ruth moved like a reed in the wind, wrapping the coarse rope around Hargrove's ankles while Daniel distracted Crowley with a faint stumble that pushed the man just enough to off-balance him. Penelope stepped close to Tanner and, with fingers that felt like knives, slipped something into his drink, a bitter, nauseous herbal mix she'd learned from the old midwife, enough to dull the senses but not to kill. It would make him sluggish, compliant, and easier to bind. The three men, so used to owning others, found themselves disarmed by a sudden, swift hand. They thrashed, cursed, and tried to reach for weapons, but Penelope had thought of that. Daniel had stolen the pistol from Crowley's belt days before and tucked it away in his coat. The dogs were quiet. Their chains had been loosed earlier by a sympathetic hand. The night had become a stage where the usual order was flipped. Once bound, the men's arrogance dissolved into panic. They pleaded, spat, and begged in turns, their voices raw, echoing across the pasture. Hargrove thrashed against the rope like a trapped animal. Tanner's face turned a peculiar white as the herb slowed his limbs. Crowley staggered, tears coming from his eyes like a child betrayed by his own weakness. Their bravado, once a shield, had become the very rope that tied them to their doom. Penelope looked at them, three faces she had known for years, three men who had treated her as a thing. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with something harder, the gravity of what she was about to do. She thought of Abigail, the soft hum of her lullabies, the cough that took her away one winter, and of all the broken bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the cotton rows. For a single heartbeat, she let sorrow and fury merge, and then she turned away without a word. They bound the men to the crude stretcher Ruth had fashioned. Daniel's hands were quick, fingers used to snatching eggs and mending fences. They carried the overseers, stumbling through the rows, toward the Anthill, the mound that had shadowed their jokes since childhood, now the place chosen as a judgment seat. As they approached, the night air seemed to thicken. The Anthill loomed like a dark cathedral, its tiny openings breathing like 100 mouths. Penelope felt the sting of the earth under her bare feet. She paused for a moment, the plan balancing on the edge of a knife. She had imagined this scene 1,000 times, each version bloodier, cleaner, sweeter than the last. None of them fully fit the reality arriving now. She had taken the first step into a new world, one where the chains of ownership had been twisted into instruments of fate. But the hardest part was yet to come. The anthill rose from the ground like a grotesque altar. In the pale shimmer of starlight, its surface crawled with restless movement, a living tide of red and black. It wasn't simply a mound of dirt, it was a fortress of insects, thousands strong, each one carrying jaws that could strip flesh from bone given enough time. To the overseers, it had always been a threat they dangled before others. Tonight, it would become their tomb. Penelope stood before it, her chest heaving, her hands raw from dragging rope across soil. Behind her, Ruth and Daniel looked on in silence, their eyes darting between Penelope's face and the writhing mound ahead. The air was heavy with the smell of clay and sweat. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then went quiet again, as if even the hound sensed something unholy unfolding. The three overseers were no longer the swaggering tyrants who strutted across the plantation. They were bound, gagged, and helpless. Thomas Hargrove glared up at Penelope with eyes full of rage, his teeth bared like a cornered animal. Joseph Tanner, weakened by the herbs, slumped against the rope, mumbling incoherently through his gag, his once perfect posture reduced to trembling spasms. William Crowley wept openly, tears streaking down his red face, his drunkenness curdling into terror as the reality of his fate clawed at him. Penelope stepped closer, her shadow falling over them. She spoke, her voice low but sharp, carrying years of swallowed anguish. "You thought I was nothing. A body, a servant, a slave." She spat the last word like poison. "But tonight, you'll feel what it is to be powerless." Hargrove snarled through the gag, straining at the rope until the fibers cut into his flesh. The sound only fueled her resolve. For every scream she had swallowed in silence, she would now hear theirs in the open air. With a nod to Daniel, they began the work. The men were dragged across the dirt, their boots digging desperate trenches in the soil. The ants stirred, disturbed by the vibrations, spilling out in thick, wriggling lines. A sickly hum filled the night as the colony awakened. Penelope's pulse thundered. This was no longer imagination, it was happening. She could almost hear her mother's voice carried in the wind, not a lullaby now, but a fierce whisper urging her forward. The first to face the mound was Crowley. He thrashed wildly, his drunken strength flaring in bursts, but Daniel's grip held fast. They forced him onto his back, his body inches from the seething insects. Crowley's eyes went wide, his muffled screams tearing at the night. His head shook violently, and tears fell into the dirt, darkening it. Penelope crouched beside him, her face so close he could see the fury burning in her eyes. She spoke slowly, so he understood every word. "You laughed when children were whipped. You laughed when my body was broken. Laugh now." With that, she shoved him forward. His body hit the mound, crushing into the living hive. Instantly, the ants swarmed, rivers of them flooding over his skin, into his clothes, biting with furious precision. His muffled scream rose into a howl of agony, his body writhing as if set aflame. Penelope did not flinch. She watched, stone-faced, as Crowley bucked and thrashed, his flesh turning red beneath the crawling tide. Each convulsion was a grotesque dance, each bite a note in the symphony of vengeance. Hargrove's eyes widened in horror at the sight. He began thrashing harder, his strength tearing small fibers from the rope. But Ruth tightened the knots, pulling him to the ground. His muffled curses sounded more like animal growls now, the fury of a man who realized for the first time that his fists could not save him. Next came Tanner. His body sagged, still heavy with the effects of the herbs, but his eyes flicked wildly, his vanity giving way to raw terror. He tried to plead through the gag, shaking his head violently as Penelope approached. She bent down, whispering in his ear, her words like ice. "You loved your reflection in glass. You thought yourself untouchable. The only reflection you'll see now is their faces staring back as the ants devour you." They pushed him beside Crowley. The ants welcomed him with the same merciless hunger, swarming across his limbs. His screams tore through the night, high and broken, as he rolled desperately, only to crush more insects into his skin. His once pristine clothes shredded under the frantic bites, his polished hair matted with dirt and sweat. The overseer's power was dissolving before Penelope's eyes, stripped away not by whips or chains, but by the smallest creatures of the earth. She felt no pity, only a grim justice. Finally, it was Hargrove's turn. Unlike the others, he didn't beg. His rage burned even as terror flickered in his eyes. He strained against the rope until his muscles bulged, veins standing like cords in his neck. When Daniel and Ruth dragged him forward, he fought like a beast, kicking, spitting, his muffled roar splitting the air. Penelope herself stepped in. She pressed her hand against his chest, forcing him down onto the mound. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. His gaze was fire and hate, but hers was colder, steadier, forged in years of suffering. "You broke me," she said quietly. "But in breaking me, you created this moment. And tonight, you will be buried alive." With a final shove, Hargrove crashed onto the anthill. The insects rose in a frenzy, a dark wave crawling across his body. He thrashed violently, his muffled roar ripping through the night as the ants bit into him. His body bucked, veins straining, his strength powerless against the relentless tide of tiny jaws. The three overseers screamed together, a chorus of agony carried into the dark fields. Their bodies writhed, swallowed by the swarm. The sound of their muffled pleas mixed with the relentless hiss of the anthill, a grotesque symphony of justice. Penelope stood over them, her chest rising and falling. She did not smile. She did not weep. Her face was carved from stone, her eyes reflecting only firelight from the torches they carried. Ruth whispered behind her, her voice trembling. "Penelope, what have we done?" Penelope turned slowly, her gaze unflinching. "We've answered them in their own language. Cruelty, pain, fear." As the overseer's screams weakened, replaced by hoarse gasps, the night seemed to close in around them. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and crushed insects. Above, the stars shone coldly, indifferent witnesses to the reckoning below. At last, when the overseers' bodies no longer writhed but twitched faintly, Penelope stepped forward. With deliberate calm, she shoveled dirt over them, smothering their bodies into the mound. Each heap of soil was a ritual, a burial not of men but of monsters. The overseers were gone, swallowed by the earth, consumed by the very threat they had once laughed about. Silence followed. Only the faint rustle of insects and the heavy breaths of Penelope, Ruth, and Daniel remained. Penelope stared at the mound, her expression unreadable. She had dreamed of this night for years, and now it was real. The chains were still on her ankles, but inside, something had broken free. But freedom bought in blood is never without consequence. And on that plantation, the absence of 3 overseers would not go unnoticed. The night air was heavy with silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm, when the world seems to hold its breath, unsure of what will come next. The mound stood still, swollen with the bodies buried beneath it, the soil shifting faintly as ants crawled across its surface, finishing their grim feast. Penelope stood with the shovel still in her hand, her knuckles white against the worn wood. Ruth clutched her shawl tight, trembling as if the earth itself had turned hostile. Daniel looked toward the distant plantation house, his eyes filled with dread. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then, Ruth's whisper cracked the silence. "They'll know. When the sun rises, they'll know they're gone." Penelope's jaw tightened. Her voice was steady, but low. "Then let them know. Let them whisper about the night their cruelty ended. Let them choke on the fear they planted in us." Yet even as she spoke, she felt the truth pressing in. The plantation was still a world ruled by chains and fire. Word of 3 missing overseers would ignite suspicion, rage, and vengeance. The masters would not let their enforcers vanish without blood to balance the scales. Daniel shifted uneasily. "We need to hide, to run. If they find us here." "They won't," Penelope cut him off. "We've given them to the earth, and the earth will keep its secret." But secrets on a plantation never stayed buried for long. By morning, the plantation stirred with confusion. Overseers who never missed their morning patrol were absent. Their cabins sat in silence, their whips hanging on the walls untouched. The slaves whispered amongst themselves, eyes wide with a hope they dared not voice. Could it be? Could the overseers truly be gone? But whispers were dangerous things. The master rode out on his horse, barking orders, demanding answers. Dogs were loosed, their noses pressed to the dirt, sniffing for trails. The hounds circled the fields, growling at the scent of fear, but the anthill remained untouched, its mound of earth undisturbed save for the faint crawl of insects. Penelope kept her face calm as she worked the fields, her body moving with practiced rhythm. But inside, her heart thundered with every passing rider, every shout from the master's men. The overseer's absence was a shadow that stretched long across the plantation, and though no one spoke it aloud, she knew eyes flicked toward her more than once. Perhaps they sensed something, or perhaps it was simply the fire burning quietly behind her gaze, a fire she could no longer hide. That evening, as the sun sank blood red on the horizon, Penelope sat alone in her cabin. The others had gone to rest, but sleep would not come for her. She stared at her hands, the same hands that had carried buckets, scrubbed floors, and picked cotton until the skin split. Hands that had also buried men alive. She felt no regret, only a strange, hollow weight. The plantation did not speak of the overseers again, at least not openly. Their names were muttered at night, half in fear, half in awe. Some claimed they had been killed by runaway slaves. Others whispered the earth itself had swallowed them, punishing their wickedness. And a few, in hushed tones, told the story of Penelope, the enslaved woman who had done what no one else dared, who had buried cruelty beneath the soil. Her story spread beyond the fields, carried on the lips of traders, whispered in church pews, murmured in the corners of slave quarters from one plantation to the next. Some said she was a demon. Others called her a saint. To those who suffered under chains, she became something greater than flesh and blood. She became a legend. But legends come with shadows. Penelope knew her time was limited. Rumors of vengeance always attracted hunters. She dreamed often of torches and nooses, of the master's men dragging her into the night. She knew if her secret was uncovered, the punishment would be unspeakable. Hanged, burned, torn apart. Yet she carried that fear as she always had, quietly, with her head held high. On Christmas that year, when the slaves were given scraps of food and forced to sing for their master's feast, Penelope stood in the corner of the hall, her chains rattling softly at her ankles. The laughter of the white men rang out, but her eyes remained fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. She thought of the Anthill, of the way the overseer's screams had mingled with the hiss of the insects. And though the memory was dark, it filled her with a strength that no feast could take away. She had given them back their fear. And in doing so, she had taken something no master, no overseer, no chain could ever steal again, her power. Years later, long after Penelope was gone, the story lingered. Around campfires, on long nights when the work was done, people spoke of the enslaved woman who had turned the earth itself into a weapon. They spoke of how she had buried 3 overseers alive in an anthill, how the ants had become her army, how she had walked away without looking back. Children listened wide-eyed, clutching their mothers' skirts. Men nodded slowly, their eyes burning with quiet pride. Women whispered her name as if it were a prayer. Penelope's life had been chains. Her nights had been filled with fear. Her body had carried scars that no one ever saw. But her revenge lived on, echoing through time like the toll of a bell in the dark. And though history would never write her name in books, it was carved into the soil, into the whispers, into the memory of those who came after. For on that night in 1854, beneath a sky of cold stars, Penelope proved something the world had tried to forget, that even the most broken, the most silenced, the most enslaved, could rise, could strike, and could bury their tormentors in the very earth they once ruled. Her chains clattered still, but inside her, something had broken free. And as long as her story was told, she would never be buried.